A mindful habit always involves discernment. It involves the capacity to choose to pay attention. That's one of the definitions of mindfulness, which I find extremely important. It's one of the first, and I still think it's one of the best. Mindfulness involves nurturing an awareness of paying attention, nurturing an awareness. We are aware. That's a way of saying discernment. We are aware that we're paying attention on purpose in the present moment.
Namaste. You're listening to the Savannah Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SavannahSpirit.com, where you can find a large selection of Om and yoga clothing, spiritual jewelry, and unique fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now here's your host, Ashton Szabo.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Savannah Podcast. We've got another really interesting show in store for you today, but I want to remind you very quickly, when you get a free moment, go over to SavannahSpirit.com/contest and enter in the weekly contest for a chance each and every week to win a $100 gift prize for the SavannahSpirit.com store. Now, our show today is about mindfulness, but in particular about a technique called Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction. Our guest today is Linda Lehrhaupt. She is the founder and executive director of the Institute for Mindfulness-Based Approaches and the co-author of the new book, Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction, the MBSR program for enhancing health and vitality. Linda, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So tell us a little bit about your background and the specific work that you do. The work is actually covered a lot in the book as well, but tell us about how you got involved with MBSR and mindfulness.
Well, in 1992, I happened to pick up a book called Full Catastrophe Living by Jon Kabat-Zinn. And from the moment I began the first page, I was just stunned with how beautiful and wonderful the program was. Prior to that time, for the 14 years before that, I had been a meditator. I'd been practicing Zen meditation very seriously, professionally as a Tai Chi and Qigong teacher, leading teacher training programs in Europe. I had moved there in 1983 to get married. And when I read the book about MBSR, I realized that I had found my work for that period of my life. I had been in education, adult education, for over 20 years before, but I recognized in the program of Jon Kabat-Zinn and his colleagues that there was really an opportunity to bring together my skills as an educator, as a practitioner of Tai Chi and Qigong, and as a trainer, and I just loved it. It offered an opportunity to, it's almost hard to believe today, but back in the 80s, these things were considered quite exotic and perhaps a bit esoteric. And now here was a program that was bringing mindfulness and mindful movement into the center of university healthcare, clinical practice, preventive medicine, integrative medicine, and I was just blown away. And I immediately contacted the Center for Mindfulness, which in those days was called the Stress Reduction Clinic. And I signed up for the first of a series of training programs, which led to my being certified. And we decided after a period of my teaching courses in Germany, about 8 or 9 years, I was teaching MBSR. Together with a bunch of colleagues in Europe, we decided to offer a teacher training program in mindfulness-based stress reduction. We had been receiving requests from various health professionals, medical, educational professionals who'd heard through the grapevine, because again, in Germany, it was even less unknown. And that's how it started. And in 2001, we founded the Institute. In 2002, we offered our first MBSR teacher training program. And since then, we've grown to be the largest on the continent and have programs in 8 European countries, not only in MBSR, but in mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, MBCT for short, and in a compassion training called Mindfulness-Based Compassionate Living, MBCL, as well as supervision, mentoring, retreats. We've really expanded. We have a faculty of 25, and that is amazing when I think about it today, considering how really we started where it was almost unknown.
When I moved back to the United States from Asia, and I'd been living on this little tropical island with very, very little stress, coming back, I moved back to Southern California where I'd grown up. The amount of stress that is just embedded in the culture is quite overwhelming. It's something that I could see in everybody around me. It's something that I fell and still fall victim to often. So I really love tools that help us work with with and process stress in more healthy ways. How is MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, different from any other mindfulness program out there?
Well, first of all, you have to know that mindfulness-based stress reduction is the mother and father of all the mindfulness-based approaches. John Kabat-Zinn started his program in 1979 at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center, where there was nothing else going on. Herbert Benson was working at Harvard in his relaxation response program, but it was really, really the beginning. And what John identified, and his colleagues, what they identified in working with stress, which for them, particularly in that environment, were things related to treatment, to people who no longer could receive any further treatment for their conditions. So working a lot with chronic pain patients and people with other kinds of chronic conditions. What he recognized is that although they had received the best medical treatment possible, there was still an area that was lacking, and that was what we call psychoeducational support to deal with the ramifications of their illness, both for themselves physically, emotionally, as well as within their family situation or work situation. So stress in that context was defined really as how to live a what we now would call a mindful life with and in the face of stress, pain, and illness. It hasn't really changed all that much, except that what I think a lot of people are facing today, and which has been particularly influenced by the digital world, by the kind of demands on people, by social dislocation, where it's quite normal for people to move 4 times in 5 years, that some of the traditional social and emotional anchors have fallen away. And people are being bombarded. In a way, I'm just amazed. Even when I came back from the United States, and I can understand what you said before, there are still quite a bit of differences between Europe and America in terms of what is considered private life. You cannot go into a restaurant almost, even a quite high-class restaurant, without being bombarded with video screens, with noise. People basically are self-involved with their own cell phones or whatever. And there's not that kind of anchoring. There's a constant distraction, a constant bombardment. And people don't often have downtime anymore. They're online, they're plugged in all the time. And of course, it's even gotten to the point where we're talking now about addiction to stimulation. And so mindfulness and MBSR, as one of the first programs, really introduced a really practical and as well as excellent educational program, which grounded people not in ideas, but in practice. And so if you look at MBSR, it's not talk, it's doing, but doing in a sense of coming closer to oneself, grounding in the present moment, anchoring in the body, bringing together the benefits of learning such things as yoga or sitting meditation in a way that really allows people to practice and over an 8-week period experience a deep immersion in mindfulness-based approaches coupled with opportunities to talk about themes, to share in class, to receive information, but primarily learning from one another, guided by a teacher, which really embeds mindfulness in their everyday life. And it's not as what has happened a little bit to mindfulness when you look at some of the books, which I would say perhaps are a little bit less let's just say that don't really help the practitioners embed it in everyday life, but present a kind of a cookie jar possibility of all different kinds of exercises. Variety is not what really makes mindfulness work. What really helps people is a continual deepening immersion in exercises coupled with an understanding of how that works with them and beginning to gain insight into their behavior, which can truly support them as they go out in the world or within their living situation to work with the stress in a healthy, mindful way. I don't know if that answers your question. I might have digressed a bit, but I can understand what you were saying, and we really need practice. It supports us tremendously.
Well, and something you touched on throughout there as well is both the necessity of being anchored in a regular practice, which is in essence creating a habit, but also the habits that we've created in our culture already, which is actually the habit of stress. I mean, one of the things that is so glaring and so prominent, seeing the contrast of living abroad than coming back, was that people, they use their cell phones, as you mentioned, as their quote unquote de-stressing thing. They're like, oh, I just need a little time to unwind. I mean, that's the big thing. They're unwinding on their cell phones, but they're not actually de-stressing in those moments. Especially, I mean, if you look at how social media and things like Facebook have become avenues for people getting their news and things like that. So now people are getting constantly bombarded, not only with ads, but news about the world doing this thing and that thing and this horrible thing. So people are constantly in this stress mode. They've literally created various habits that create more stress in their lives, but often they think that those habits are what are supposed to be de-stressing them. Oh, I'm going to sit on my phone and tune out for a little bit while I'm scrolling. That doesn't actually help stress. So can you talk a little bit about how people create habits of stress and then how to create a healthy habit around a mindfulness-based practice to reshape how one interacts with stress?
Well, I think we have to make a distinction, or I'd like to make a distinction when you use the word habit. Yeah. Mm-hmm. You can talk about mindful habits and you can talk about mindless habits. Yeah. And one of the aspects of a mindless habit is that it truly is not, I'm sorry to use the word, but it's not very far from a form of addiction. It's responding to a kind of a stimulation which creates its own loop, which requires then more stimulation, but it is not relaxing because it is also a force of distraction, as well as, even though we may not be actively involved in the sense of thinking about something, our whole neural network, as well as other networks in our body, is being affected by this constant involvement in the eyes and the ears and other things that's going on through the media. And so there's not a mindful habit always involves discernment. It involves the capacity to choose to pay attention. That's one of the definitions of mindfulness, which I find extremely important. It's one of the first, and I still think it's one of the best. Mindfulness involves nurturing an awareness of paying attention, nurturing an awareness. We are aware. That's a way of saying discernment. We are aware that we're paying attention on purpose in the present moment. And there's more to the definition, but let's stick with that for the moment. And what that means is that we are not being drained. We are in contact with what we're in contact with. And that is very, very different from this kind of low-level draining that goes on as far as social media and other kinds of things are concerned. So a habit, if it involves what I think is expressed as a healthy habit, involves that sense of being present. That's what often is meant by that, being present in what is happening and also being able to discern, is this helpful for me or is this not? And what I define as helpful can be health enhancing or relaxing or being able to turn off so that one can turn in. Yeah. And I think mindfulness is really fundamental to creating a healthy habit, as you like, because there is that sense of also becoming more and more aware what is helpful, what is quote unquote good for me, and what is not helpful, what is draining, what is debilitating.
Something that I notice, and it's perhaps a byproduct of our age, where we emphasize the importance of validating our feelings and saying, well, we're all valid in our feelings, we can all have them, we don't want to suppress anything, we don't want to repress anything. But what that's created oftentimes is people saying, okay, well, I'm having an emotion, so I'm just going to vomit my emotion on everyone and everything around me without any real accountability towards things. And that actually leads to more difficulties, more stress, more problems, because there's no, for lack of a more mindful approach to how we're engaging emotions. And on the flip side, we often see people then going to the other end of the spectrum with practices like mindfulness, where they think it's a cold, disconnected aloofness from the emotions. So how does a mindfulness practice help us to relate to our emotions in a more skillful way so that we can use, as you said, discernment to recognize, well, yes, I'm feeling this emotion, but that doesn't mean I'm feeling anger right now, but that doesn't mean I need to vomit that anger all over the people around me, for example. How is mindfulness working to integrate emotions into our life?
Well, again, I have to start by saying that we can't look for a quick fix for anything in life. And particularly when we're talking about working skillfully or relating in a skillful way to our emotions, it does involve a period of training which proceeds in certain steps. First of all, one of the most harmful aspects of emotions is, in terms of how we, as you say, let it loose on others, is that there's no kind of space between a stimulus and a response. So someone may say something, we immediately come back, what are you saying? What are you doing? And mindfulness teaches us to, if you like, hang out in that space between stimulus and how we respond. And a very crucial element of MBSR is the difference between reaction and response. Okay, so a reaction is a kind of an automatic reaction. Our emotions are somehow triggered. We're hurt, we feel ignored, we're insulted, whatever. Yeah, so something in us is being touched and we immediately react. But we're not really in contact with what exactly is going on. Yeah. So, for example, let me give you an example, which from my own life. I'm a mother, and as a parent, there have been times when it's been very, very difficult. And in the past, something would come up and I would be busy, or perhaps I wasn't attending so much, and I would just immediately react as if, oh, my daughter's not listening to me or whatever. And mindfulness practice taught me to really not immediately fire back in a situation, but to stay with what I was truly feeling. Now, when I say feeling in mindfulness, feeling is not about an intellectual or emotional response. I learned to recognize that my breath was getting stronger. I learned to recognize that there was a flush in my face. I was feeling warmer. I learned that I was tensing some muscles around the jaw, and learning training to just be with those physical sensations for a moment helped for there to be space and to be time. And in that time, I could see, for example, well, my daughter's really hurt about something, or it's not about me, or I learned not to take things so personally, so quickly. And in that space, a kind of a discernment is then possible, and I can have more of a choice about how I choose to respond. It doesn't mean that I might not express anger, but the anger can be in a more skillful or constructive way and not just screaming my head off. Yeah. So working mindfully with emotions, we're not overnight going to be some idol of who we think is perfectly calm or whatever, but we gain much more insight into our life and into our relationships. The other side of it, which you talked about, a kind of a detachment, is also a misunderstanding of how to be mindful with emotions. Mostly, it's really just a reaction to the hurt and pain and the sense of powerlessness that one may feel. And the tendency is then to block out or to suppress, which is not wrong, but it's not necessarily a skillful way. And also, people who tend then to repress or to suppress, underneath is often a huge range of emotions. And the mindfulness practice can help also those who are disengaging to be more in contact in a skillful way. So in both ends of the spectrum, there's a disengagement from what is actually happening. And mindfulness can truly support us with practice to be really with our emotions and not driven by them or suppressed by them.
Now, in your example, you brought up something that I think is really important as well, and you were talking about communicating with your daughter. Poor communication itself can be a huge cause of stress. As someone who's constantly working with better communication with my wife and my daughter and everyone around me, I was definitely going down the ascetic route. I wanted to just go live in a cave and forget all communications and human relationships because that was a comfortable place for me. So communication is absolutely an area that I've struggled with. I tend to be very direct and don't have as much room for things. And it's been a challenging process for me over my life, especially in my adult life. I want to talk a little bit about how communication skills can be such a big cause of stress and how mindfulness, because you speak to this specifically in your book, how mindfulness can help us in communicating more skillfully with everyone around us.
Well, one of the ways that we work on communication in the MBSR program, is that we do exercises that are very closely connected to the skill of listening. It is true, and the social scientists and psychologists have researched to say that difficult communication in relationships is probably one of the biggest sources of stress in our lives. And that can also extend to the workplace as well. And one of the key aspects of that is that we are not really listening in communication situations. There is such a filter that's going on. When someone may be saying something, there's a filter in front of it of our ideas, of our beliefs, of our emotional makeup. And we hear things, but what actually comes through is probably much more related to what's going on in ourselves than what's actually being said. The other thing is that we're often listening, but we already have our response in our head. And so again, there's not truly a sense of communication, of exchange, but it's almost things are happening in isolation. One person is speaking, one person is listening, but communication in that sense we're talking about as a social relationship is not really happening. So we do exercises in the MBSR program. They're quite simple, and yet they're deeply effective. Someone will talk about something relatively simple, like what they had for breakfast, and someone will repeat back to them what they said. And the difference between what they said and what was repeated back to them, often people begin to bring their own personal judgments in. Someone will say, I had muesli for breakfast, and the other one will say, I had hard muesli for breakfast and it didn't taste good. And, so there's all this kind of personal thing that's coming on. So we need to learn to truly, first of all, listen. Just listen. And then in communication, when we communicate or respond back, are we, it's almost like we're in service to one another. We are supporting each person with our presence. And how do we do that? Well, we do that, for example, by establishing physical contact or eye contact and looking at people, not talking in our cell phone as we're speaking to someone, and kind of tuning in, practicing a process of attunement so that there is really a sense of being in contact with one another, and perhaps also learning sometimes to say, well, I'm not sure you really heard me. I'd like to express it again. Or someone might say, I'm not sure I understood you. Could you say that again? We so rarely do that. We say, yeah, we nod our head in one thing and another. But that's a kind of a form of empty activity that's not really part of communication. And so when we're communicating in that way, and in mindfulness we train to be in our bodies, there is a much more physical or oral connection that happens, as well as the training in emotions that I talked about, that really allows us to be there and communicate, and not just each of us making noise, so to speak.
Well, and you make that a wonderful distinction and just kind of put it into words, the difference between talking at each other instead of talking with each other, where when people are just speaking to something, but there's no receptivity, there's no dance, there's no communication. It's just all me and then all you, and then all me and then all you. And then there really isn't any real beneficial connection that comes from that, because it's just so one-sided and then the other one-sided. So
I'd like to address something.
Sure.
With you, the way you're expressing it. We are human beings. And we're all the product of our living situation and of how we grew up and the things that influenced us. And this kind of work is not easy. It's not easy, especially when we're living with tremendous stress. And so the attitude that we try to cultivate in mindfulness is not, I understand many of us are frustrated and we're whatever, but I think we need to talk about this in a sense of wisdom and compassion, that many of us are trying to do our best, even in communication. But because we haven't had the kind of support that mindfulness training or other forms of mindful social communication can teach us, we just don't really know. We don't know how to do it, and we don't know how to recognize it when we're doing it. So I would just like to a little bit reframe the conversation to say that, yes, this is what we do, but it's not because we're so totally self-focused that, that is a little bit harsh. It can be sometimes, but I rather, maybe it comes from my background as an educator, but I would rather see it as, yes, these are places we can develop, and with the best of intentions and with training, it gives us a much more active and positive, in the sense of skillful, way of being with it. So I'd just like to correct a little bit the tone of how we talk about these things, if you know what I mean.
And so for people that are listening and they want to communicate more skillfully, they want to work on it, can you recommend a partner practice, if you will, something that they can do in their lives? I think that the insights are really wonderful as well, but something that they could say, okay, I want to practice this. Let me sit down with my partner, with my friend, with somebody that I work with, and practice a skill of better communicating or listening. Do you have something that you could frame that's a simple practice that essentially anyone could do that wants to communicate more mindfully?
I'm not into quick fixes. I said that before. And what I'm trying to say is that without a training in an awareness training, which involves us really grounding in the body and in the mind, these kind of exercises can be very helpful for insight and perhaps seeing where areas in our communication skills or whatever that we can work on. But they're not going to hold in the long run if they're not accompanied by a regular meditation practice with guidance where we can develop those skills, where it will not be a one-off kind of thing, but that we can integrate it more and more into our lives. But I can, at the same time, suggest an exercise. It's very important that if you decide to practice mindful communication with someone, that you agree on kind of ground rules. For example, that you will talk for timed periods. And I would say usually a period of about 3 to 5 minutes might be a good time. That you talk about something which is not too emotionally challenging. That's kind of hard because our mind goes immediately to the most emotionally challenging things of our life. But it might be something as simple as the traffic in the morning or something like that, something that we're not too personally involved in. And then one person is a speaker and one is a listener, and you agree on who is who, knowing that you'll change roles and that someone will begin to speak and the other person will simply listen. And try to listen in a mindful way, but not speaking, not interrupting, not asking questions, not making too many facial gestures, not being dead, but being mindfully listening. And the person has a chance to speak. At the end of that time, of the 3 to 5 minutes, you pause for a moment. Each of you, again, come into contact with your breathing, with your physical sense of sitting in a chair or whatever it be, and then switch roles. And so now the listener speaks and the other person listens mindfully. And that's the simplest exercise. And then at the end of that period, just perhaps talking about how did it feel to be listened to? Not focusing on the speaker, but focusing on the listener. What was your experience? So we don't go into the content of what was talked about. We talk about the experience of speaking in a warm environment, which is spacious, which really gives someone, the speaker, the time to just talk. It's amazing. That's one of the exercises we do in class. It's amazing what people begin to experience. And the deepest thing that people say is, I don't know when I have been listened to in such a generous way. So this kind of practice is a practice of generosity. It's also a practice of deep respect. And it's a very wonderful training in mindfulness. I hope that's helpful for you.
Absolutely. And one of the things that you touch upon that I think we both, I mean, as teachers, understand the importance of a regular practice, and that every time there's a new fad of this or that, it's really easy to get attracted to the next new thing without any real stability with anything. But the challenge that a lot of people have is maintaining a regular practice, especially because as the more stress they get, the more excuses there are not to maintain a regular practice, which then, of course, is when you probably need it the most. How do you, with all the work that you do, encourage people and in what ways can they or tips can they use to maintain a more steady and regular practice in their life?
Well, it's really been shown so often, both in education and in the fields that we work in, that learning in a social context has a deeply supportive function for people. In other words, practicing together is a lot easier than practicing alone. And so that's one reason why these courses in various mindfulness-based approaches, and there's so many of them out there, or courses in yoga or mindful body work or whatever, why so many people enjoy going to class. So that's one thing. I think it's a tremendous support to be learning together with others, to have also the benefit of a guide or a teacher, but it could also be a practice group, a group of like-minded people who get together to practice together, where there may not be a teacher, but there can be kind of peer supervision and people supporting one another. It is true that a lot of people don't have the time necessarily to go to class, but what can be helpful is from time to go for a refresher evening, or to go perhaps, if possible, for a day immersion or a weekend immersion in what they might be doing. And a lot of mindfulness-based programs offer the possibility of coming back after one's finished a course for practice sessions or for participating in the day-long retreats that are part of the program. We do also have now more resources for media online, and that again can be helpful, but I think it's really a key aspect that from time to time one can share it with others in a social situation so that there is that sense of support. We need to make time to find time. And it might sound a bit funny, but probably getting ourselves to the meditation cushion or chair is probably the hardest part of doing the practice. And at the same time, mindfulness practice or meditation practice can help us to recognize the kind of disturbances or distractions that may come up, or all sorts of excuses. Because so often we make those excuses and we end up sitting on the couch eating popcorn, or we end up doing something else. And actually, I often tell my meditation students, your practice is simply, to begin with, put your body on your meditation place. And whatever happens for that 10 minutes, set a time, which is very helpful, set a clear time. With experience, we do ask our practitioners, our exercises in MBSR are 40 minutes at least, but we don't start with that. We start with, for example, a 10-minute mindfulness of breathing exercise that we ask participants to practice for the first few weeks. So just getting to your space and sitting there, or standing there if it's a standing meditation, and simply just being with what's going on. Something, we often make ourselves stressed because we say, I have to practice mindfulness of breathing for 10 minutes, or I have to do my yoga asanas, and of course also have to do them perfect. No, just being in that space of practice and bringing ourselves, not putting ourselves, but bringing ourselves to the pace of practice, even when we're doing it a bit reluctantly. That is what builds the sense of continuity and the sense of mindful discipline. I'm not talking about a rigid discipline. I'm talking, you might call it a healthy habit, where we simply again and again come back. And with that, it deepens. Going from one thing to another might be okay in the beginning when we're looking for what works for us, but we'll never deepen and we'll never have that kind of really involvement if we're only shopping around all the time. That's another form of distraction. So that's what I would suggest,
When you mentioned the importance of support, and obviously you provide a lot of support to your community and just the world at large through the work that you do, tell us about the best way to connect to the courses that you offer, your book, you and the work that you do, your website, all that good stuff.
just in terms of finding mindfulness, if your listeners are particularly interested in courses in mindfulness-based stress reduction, there are excellent training centers around the country in the United States who have trained highly qualified teachers to teach MBSR. One source of finding a teacher is on the website of the Center for Mindfulness. They have a listing of teachers they've trained. Other training centers, like at the University of San Diego, University of Southern California, or Duke Center for Integrative Medicine, or in Toronto, there are great centers in Toronto and Vancouver and other places, to look into the possibility of signing up for an MBSR course. Very often it's just helpful to put in MBSR Cincinnati or MBSR San Francisco or Oshkosh, Kansas. And probably today there is someone in your area that may be offering a program. It might be in a private practice, it might be in a yoga school, it might be in a clinic, in a hospital situation, it might be in a school program. It's not really hard to find a program in mindfulness-based stress reduction. There are also programs in mindfulness that people may be offering. I would take a look at the credentials and where people have trained, because there are many people who have wonderful intentions but may not have the level of skill, particularly if we're working with more difficult kind of situations. And there are also some online programs which have a high quality, and that might be possible for people who can't get to a course on a regular basis. Our institute is in Europe. And if you have listeners in Europe, we have the same kind of situation in Europe. We have wonderful training institutes in the United Kingdom, in Ireland, in Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Norway, Italy. It's amazing. Spain. It's amazing how mindfulness is spread. So I'd simply suggest that people perhaps either go to the national teachers organizations, which are in the various countries, which will list their particular practitioners. Because, for example, the German National Association, we have over 750 qualified MBSR teachers who are offering programs. Our institute is primarily a teacher training institute. So we actually train the teachers. And if you go on our website, which is the instituteformindfulness.org in Europe, we list the teachers that we have trained in our various mindfulness-based training programs in all the 8 European countries in which we are offering training programs. If there are mindfulness teachers listening, I'd like to make a plug for a podcast series, which I've started, a nonprofit podcast series called the Mindfulness-Based Teacher Project.org, which was really a program of short podcasts up to 15 minutes to specifically support teachers of mindfulness and mindfulness-based approaches, as well as mindful body work. And then I'd like to make perhaps a plug for our new book, which has just come out in New World Library. It's called Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction, the MBSR program for enhancing health and vitality. And we have, in that book, it's a book not only for people who might want to think about taking an MBSR course, but also for people who are in course or maybe considering what could mindfulness do for my life and how could it support me. So, I hope that has been helpful in terms of resources that are available online, in class, as well as there is some wonderful literature as well. Of course, the classic on MBSR is John Kabat-Zinn's book, Full Catastrophe Living, which is, even after all these years, is an amazing, wonderful, inspiring introduction to MBSR. So, and our book gives a shorter but deeper, and not deeper than John's book, but a shorter and helpful introduction also to the 8 weeks of the MBSR program.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Linda, for coming on the show today and sharing your passion and insights for the work that you do. I'm sure that our listeners have enjoyed and learned something new today. For all of our listeners out there, thank you so much for listening. I hope you all have a very present and mindful moment. Namaste. Hey everybody, it's Ashton here with an announcement. We're starting a weekly contest giveaway over at Savannah Spirit. If you'd like to enter into the contest to win one of our weekly prizes, go to savannahspirit.com/contest. If you enjoyed listening to the podcast today, we'd really appreciate it if you went over to iTunes, left us a review, leave us some comments, and share this podcast with anyone who you think might enjoy it. Also want to invite you to go check out Savannah East, which is the name of our blog and also the name of a Facebook group where I interact with guests and our audience. We'll post recent episodes up there as well as interesting articles relating to our guests and or the topics on the shows. And again, thank you so much for listening. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Savannah Podcast. To find out more about Savannah, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Savannah on Facebook at facebook.com/Savannah Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savannaeast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Savannah Podcast.